have a growth model that requires accumulation of very large amounts of debt to maintain demand, because our economies are very good at producing stuff.
As I say, maybe there was something bigger going on, like, for example, the world's largest energy shock.
What I see on the ground in the margins in China and Brazil and Bangladesh and Nigeria are a set of 5 tensions at work that I think are going to have to resolve themselves one way or another in the next couple decades.
In general terms, the public policy response that was proposed to cope with the economic crisis emphasized a return to growth. Economic growth, a conventional and fairly narrowly defined notion of growth, which involves borrowing enormous amounts of money, in this case not in the private sector or from home equity, but now from the public purse, to maintain consumption and demand in our economies. So we have a growth model that requires accumulation of very large amounts of debt to maintain demand, because our economies are very good at producing stuff in very large quantities. So we're constantly faced with a demand failure in our economies. And now we're trying to do the same thing. We had a crisis of too much debt, and we're trying to solve the crisis of too much debt and too much stuff, especially in wealthy economies, by borrowing more money and producing more stuff. And I think, in a sense, the current model of growth, and I'm not against growth in toto, but some notions of growth and current models of growth, the current model of growth got us both into our economic crisis, and it's demonstrably aggravating our environmental crisis, because it tends to produce a steady increase in material and energy throughput and waste output from our economies. So we have a problem there, a fundamental premise, an addiction to a particular kind of economic growth that's doing us a lot of damage. My third point is that, more narrowly defined, it's related to the second, is that the Keynesian policy response to our economic crisis involved, and this is especially obvious in Canada, generally enormous amounts of investment in infrastructure that was carbon intensive, or that sustained a carbon-intensive economy. And in particular, I mean roads. We looked for shovel-ready stuff, and the stuff that could be rolled out really fast was road construction. And I don't know about your particular part of Ontario or of Canada, but in my particular part of Ontario, all of a sudden it was hard getting from one place to another place, because there was construction everywhere. More roads, widening roads, ditches, drainage systems, sewers, but especially pavement and roads. The paving companies did very well. This isn't the kind of investment that we should be having if we're concerned about the carbon intensity of our economies. And here's the critical point. Each one of these shocks is what I call a moment of contingency. It's a moment at which there's flexibility in the system. I think it was Paul Romer, the economist at Stanford, later picked up by Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff in the White House, who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, there's a certain truth to that. The idea is that at a moment of crisis or shock, in this case the economic crisis, that there are opportunities to do things because received wisdom has been discredited. Special interests who promulgate the received wisdom about the status quo have been discredited. And so people are prepared to consider alternatives. But these are also moments that are extremely dangerous, because these are moments when, in particular, extremists or extremist groups can be active and can push, say, a social system in particular in a direction that could be extremely dangerous for everybody concerned. Extremist groups tend to be well organized, they tend to be networked together in advance, they have resources set aside, they know who the enemy is, and they're ready to go. And the rest of us in these moments of contingency who aren't extremists, and that's the majority of people, are often wandering around thinking, oh, gee, this is not a very good situation, what do we do now? So much of my argument over the last few years is that it's important in the period of time prior to a shock, whether it's an economic shock or an environmental shock or what have you, to begin thinking about and preparing for these moments when there might be a lot of flexibility, when people are scared and angry and looking for answers, it would be helpful if thoughtful people, non-extremists, had some suggestions for what direction a society could go in to reform, say, its economy or its relationship with the environment.
So as we've heard, the financial crisis shook the global financial, if you'll allow me, ecosystem. And it deepened our understanding that it is indeed an interdependent system, that our economies are linked, that our sovereign actions are not without international consequences, that we can function independently with different systems, but there reaches a point where what the other does can reverberate through the whole ecosystem. Are you recognizing something that we might think about our natural ecosystem? That's something that's true for the financial system. And I think that if we could grasp this for our natural ecosystem and reflect it in public policy, I think, we might be moving closer to where we're trying to get to. And the other thing I want to talk about is Nick Le Pen spoke about the resiliency. That's usually a term reserved for ecology, the resiliency of the system. And Nick talked about how we have weakened the underlying resiliency of the whole global financial ecosystem over the last couple of years. We responded by recognizing the need for quick and coordinated action through the G8 and the G20, the need to restructure our governance, and we're exploring in a rational and examined way the lessons to learn that we can learn to avoid these dynamics in the future. So a question I have for all of you is, could we begin to apply some of these lessons to at least the natural ecosystem and possibly the political ecosystem?
What happens if I'm right and they're wrong? If this really was an energy crisis, what does it say about our ability to deal with future energy crises? And when oil is already trading at $80 a barrel, this is not an academic question. Turn the clock back 3 years ago, and today's recession-scarred oil price would have been a world record high. Now it trades when most of the economies in the so-called G7 haven't even got back to the levels they were before the recession began. Where do you think oil will be trading in the near future? I think oil will be trading at triple-digit oil prices within the next 12 months. But unfortunately, the next time that we hit that price, we won't be able to turn on the spigot of government spending. We won't be able to run up those massive deficits. In fact, we'll be doing the opposite. We'll be paying them back. Fiscal brakes are being applied all around the world. Countries like Greece are being asked to sacrifice 10% of its GDP at the altar of deficit reduction, which is why bond traders are shorting Greek bonds, because they know that no rational population is going to make that sacrifice. Other economies like Portugal and Spain and even Great Britain are being asked to give up 6 to 7% of its GDP. And the only reason that Obama was asking his G7 partners at the recent fiasco in Toronto to increase their spending is because Congress is not going to allow him to increase his spending. Indeed, Congress also wants to clamp on the fiscal brakes. So the problem, of course, is that not only have we used up our fiscal latitude, but in fact, we are going to be shifting in gears, going from akin to having your foot floored on the accelerator to slamming those brakes. Maybe, just maybe, there was something else going on. Something else that would have been an alternative to the Cleveland hypothesis of the world economy. Something else that would have answered the question that indeed, if it was distressed U.S. property markets like Cleveland that were the epicenter of this financial crisis come recession, why did economies in Western Europe and Japan have much deeper recessions than the U.S.? And why did those economies go into recession even before Cleveland went into recession? As I say, maybe there was something bigger going on, like, for example, the world's largest energy shock, where oil prices went from around circa $35 in 2004 to $148 circa 2008. I say that because, in fact, every other oil shock, none of which had been anywhere near as large as this oil shock, even in inflation-adjusted terms, all of the other past oil shocks led to huge recessions. The OPEC oil shock in 1973, the second OPEC oil shock that led to a double-dip recession in 79 and 82. In 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and left half of those countries' oil fields on fire, oil spiked to what was then the record high of $41, creating another recession. In fact, the only global sort of recession that didn't have oil's footprints on it was the Asian financial meltdown in 1998 that didn't even wash ashore the economies of the major oil-consuming economies.
But I'll confess my physical knowledge of the Couchiching conference comes mainly from Stephen Vizinsay's novel In Praise of Older Women, where the denouement of that novel, of course, takes place at this conference, and it gave me the real sense that this is a place of roiling romantic opportunity and so on. So, on that note, I'd like you all to meet Elizabeth Renzetti, my wife, and who actually knows Stephen Vizinsay. And based possibly on that, she thought it would be a very wise idea to come along with me. I think we need to ask the larger question, what are most people in the world today actually experiencing? What are they planning on doing with themselves that's different, that's going to push things along? And what forces are pressing on their lives? What will this era be remembered for, in other words? And what I see on the ground in the margins in China and Brazil and Bangladesh and Nigeria are a set of 5 tensions at work that I think are going to have to resolve themselves one way or another in the next couple decades that cannot stay as they are. One is the supply of food and its price and availability. Second is the problem of population growth. Third is the threat of premature death, of starvation, sanitary infection, communicable disease, and so on. Fourth is the ability of women and girls to lead full and equal lives, which I think we've realized now is not a incidental topic, but that is a root cause of many other things. And the fifth is what we could say is the maintenance of a livable ecological balance, which for people on the ground manifests itself, I think, first as the availability of basic resources, but also increasingly the effects of temperature increases and ocean level rises. And if you watch closely, you realize that all 5 of these things are part of one big thing. They're the same problem.